So this is week 6 in a series called Investigating Jesus. It's the last week of this series, and it's been a pretty good one. I really enjoyed it. Throughout this, if you get a chance, you can go online and watch the talks. But even more interesting than that was testimonies that got popped up. Dave's testimony was here. He ended up getting baptized. What is that? 3 weeks ago, something like that. And then on Father's Day, Tony was here. He was sharing his testimony. And Jill was back on Mother's Day. It's just been kind of an exciting time to hear what it means to change your life and follow Jesus. And what we've been emphasizing in this series is the fact that Christianity is not about following a bunch of rules. It's not about a bunch of traditions. It's not the history of all the good things that the church has done or all the horrible things that the church has done. It's nothing about that. To be truly Christian means that you are a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. It all centers in him. There is, all the rest is just peripheral stuff, but to be a Christian, to be a Christ follower, means that you follow Jesus. And then what we've been doing is we've been looking at, so how can we actually believe that Jesus existed a couple thousand years ago? Right? Because we've heard stories of Santa Claus and lots of other things throughout our childhood. How do we know that the history about Jesus is accurate? And so, you know, if you grew up in Sunday school, it's because the Bible tells me so. But then we don't really investigate why it's significant that the Bible tells us so. What's so significant about the Bible even? And so what we have done over the last 6 weeks is we have gone into investigating whether Jesus, the historical evidence of Jesus is accurate. And we ask this question. It's not about whether you believe the whole Bible or don't believe the whole Bible. I think I can give evidence to reasons why you should believe the whole Bible, but that's not the question at this point. The question is Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John a reliable an account of actual events? And we looked at how when these guys were writing their letters or their documents, they weren't actually writing them to contribute them to this thing called the Bible. As far as they knew, they didn't know that these writings would be included in any sort of book that would exist 2,000 years later. They were just writing what they saw. And in the case of Luke, Luke is writing to this guy called Theophilus. And as he is writing to Theophilus, he says, I'm writing you this so that you might actually believe the things that you've already heard, or to support the things that you already believe. It says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. And so he is writing this just to support the fact that this Theophilus, who's been taught things about Jesus, Luke is writing to support with supporting evidence that the things about Jesus are true. Right? And so we've been looking at the book of Luke and different aspects, and this week we're going way into Luke chapter 23. And in Luke chapter 23, verse 33, it says, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And what's a little bit interesting about, as Luke is writing this, he doesn't go, so Theophilus, crucifixion looks like this, and goes on to describe it, like, because in our society, we don't get it. Unless you've been told the historical realities of crucifixion, it doesn't make sense. We don't see it day to day. But the people that Luke is writing this to, they've seen it. This is something they understand, right? It would, if Luke was writing this to Theophilus and he said, somebody will stand one day before the firing squad, he would have to describe it to this audience because they hadn't seen guns, right? But as Luke is writing this, He's writing it to a group who understand crucifixion. And the Romans, they didn't invent crucifixion, they just kind of perfected it. And crucifixion was not just an execution, it was a message. It was designed to prolong the agony of the person who was dying for as long as possible. And it wasn't done in private or behind curtains, it was done publicly in public places where people could see that this person is an enemy of Rome. And this is what happens to enemies of Rome. And so, for us to get it, we kind of need to hear it described. But for these folks, they knew that already. And so when it talks about Jesus being crucified, they understood the agony of what that was. All right? And then it goes into this. So Jesus is getting crucified, this horrible, horrible, horrible death. And then what Luke records, as soon as he says that Jesus is being crucified, he records this. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them." I'm going, what? I mean, you already know this, but think about this. What did you say about the last person that cut you off in traffic? Right? Okay, Father, forgive them. Like, that's not where we go. And this guy is being executed in the most horrible public way. And Jesus says, "Father, forgive them." It's admirable. Maybe it's weak. It's definitely Jesus. Because as you read through the stories of Jesus, this actually fits 100% with the life he lived. He died the way he had lived. And what I love about Jesus, when he does this, he actually follows it up with something that helps us understand our issues with forgiveness. Because Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." You know, the biggest problem we have with forgiveness is that we assume the people who offended us did it on purpose, that they knew exactly what they were doing. And Jesus says, in his forgiveness of the ones who were crucifying him, he says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Do you know how much that affects your perspective on the people who have offended you? Like, if you could, if somebody actually harms you by accident, it's a whole lot easier to forgive than if you think that they intentionally harmed you. Jesus helps us in our role in forgiveness by saying, just assume the best. Assume the best. It changes your attitude towards everything. When you have a really good friend and and he accidentally trips you, he or she accidentally trips you and you sprain your ankle, it's a whole lot easier to forgive them if you assumed it was an accident than if you assumed that they were trying to harm you, right? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. But the things that these people were doing to Jesus were horrible. Carries on. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And when you kind of put yourself in that scene, there's Jesus on the cross, his hands spread wide, and instead of cursing the people who are doing this to them, he says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And the people who are crucifying him on the ground, they're going, "What do you say?" "I don't know. Your role." Like they don't even care. They don't get the significance of Jesus' forgiveness. They don't get the significance of God's forgiveness for them. Which is also kind of us. You know the reason why we struggle with forgiveness? One, we assume that the other people intended it. We create our own narrative about what they intended to do. But most importantly, we lose sight of the significance of God's forgiveness for us. We don't even really think about it. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And the people he was offering forgiveness to just divided up his clothes, cast lots. See, Jesus carries this theme of forgiveness, and even if we just step back to Jesus' arrest, he's told his disciples. We even get looking at this. He's told his disciples that this is going to happen. They're having the Last Supper. Somebody says, should we take some swords? And yep, how many you got? Got a couple. Blah blah blah. They show up. Judas comes along and kisses Jesus, and the other soldiers move in to arrest Jesus. And we pick it up in this scene in Luke 22. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Right? Is it time to fight? And if we keep reading, there's this, and one of them didn't wait for the answer. We can read about this. It's actually Peter. Peter has a habit of punching first. And it's like, and one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. I don't think he was going for his ear. Right? And in that moment, when somebody says, "Hey, should we strike?" While Peter is striking the servant, Jesus says this. Jesus answered, "No more of this. Stop it." Was what they were doing right? Right? That's the question. So if you are around an innocent person who is about to be arrested, is it right to defend them? You're allowed to nod yes, right? Like our thinking is, way to go, guys. Peter had to step up and do something. And Jesus says, stop it. Enough. In our view of right and wrong, the disciples were doing the right thing when they stepped up to defend Jesus. And Jesus goes, stop it. Stop with the right and wrong. Just stop it. And he touched the man's ear and healed them. And if you know this story, at that point, all of Jesus' followers unfollowed. All of Jesus' followers who thought, come on, I'm doing the right thing. When Jesus said, stop it, he heals the servant's ear, and all the disciples flee. And if we read a little further into that story, the guilt that those followers feel from leaving Jesus in his most vulnerable moment, we read about Judas' suicide. Peter was a pretty close second. The guilt you feel when you walk away, when you unfollow, it's really, really heavy. Now, Jesus had warned them about this, as I said. If we flip back to Luke chapter 9, it goes like this. And he said, as he's talking to his disciples, I don't know why. I picture this around a campfire for some reason. I don't know if it is. But he's just talking to his disciples. It's like an afternoon. And he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day raised to life." Now, what's interesting about this is you can read this account in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke doesn't include this part that I think is pretty important, and I want to mention it. But the other two do, Matthew and Mark. And Mark, who we believe Peter gave Mark all the information he needed to write down the book of Mark. That's sort of what history would tell us. So in this moment, Peter pulls Jesus aside, right? And he says, "Stop this, Jesus. Stop this stupid talk. This isn't going to happen. If there's anything I can do to defend you, I will do it. Me and the boys, we got a plan," right? And to me, that sounds like the right thing, right? Like if you were to come and tell me that you're in big trouble, I think that the right thing for me to do is say, "Hey, we got this. You know what? I can make a few calls, whatever you need. We can solve this." And you know what Jesus' response to Peter is? This gets really, really good. So Jesus has said, I've got to suffer. I'm going to be killed. Peter goes up and he says, "Oh, this is just not going to happen." And this is what Jesus says to Peter. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." What? I mean, Peter's just trying to do the right thing. "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." You're just trying to do the right thing, and you're not listening, Linda. I don't know where that came from. So you're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then Jesus carries on. We jump back into this account in Luke. He says, then he said to them, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves." Must deny themselves. If you want to be a follower of Jesus, then you mimic Jesus, who denied himself. Denied himself of his rights. He denied himself of what he was owed. And the account carries on. He says, "My disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross." Remember I had said that everybody knew what crucifixion was, right? In this culture, you didn't have to tell them what it was to take up a cross. But as I listened to this story, or as I've read this story over the years, my thoughts have always gone to, this is after Jesus has been crucified that this statement is made. But it isn't. It's long before. Jesus hasn't even told anybody that he will be crucified. Right? It's not about Jesus' crucifixion. It's about a cultural reality that the most submissive, surrendered thing you can do is take up a cross. Right? When you read the story of Jesus' crucifixion, he was convicted, and then he picked up his cross and carried it as far as he could. Why would you do that? Right? Ultimately, what are they going to do? Kill you? Right? If you refuse to take up your cross, what are they going to do? And Jesus says the most submissive, surrendered thing you can do is just take up your cross. And Jesus says that's what it is to be a disciple of me, to follow me, to do what I do. It's not about doing the right thing. It's not about being right. It's not about standing up for your rights. It's actually about surrendering and submitting to the circumstances you find yourself in. And those aren't fighting words. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Take up your cross. And then Jesus says this, daily. That this is a decision that you make every day. You have to make it every day because yesterday's decision won't stand for today. It's not just about a simple prayer. It's about actually engaging daily in the circumstances you find yourself in, surrendering to them and allowing God to work through them, whatever those circumstances are. Right? And God calls you to freedom, but it's on His terms. And then, take up your cross daily and follow me. See, I can stand up here and I can talk and I can tell you what to do, but I'm an imperfect example of what that looks like. Like I really am. But when Jesus says it, Jesus is a perfect example of what He preaches. And when the people who are executing Him in an unfair, unjust, He's not guilty of anything way, when I would be shouting, I didn't do it, He is proclaiming forgiveness on those who are executing Him. He is surrendered to the circumstances He finds Himself in. Follow me. And then He just says, this is why it matters. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? He says, I'm going to tell you why this matters. Because life is better when you do it my way. All right? You may not end up with like a whole lot of money in your account, and you might. That's not the determining factor. But you will live a life with purpose. A life where every day matters. A life where you follow Jesus in the circumstances you find yourself in. You will experience Jesus walking with you in a more intimate and powerful way. The life that you live when you follow Jesus is felt by the people around you. And because you are better, the people around you are better. It's a life worth living. It's becoming who you were designed to be. And Jesus says, what does it gain somebody if they get all the money in the world and have never discovered their true calling, never become who they were designed to be? They forfeit their true selves. Follow me, He says. Meanwhile, back in Luke 23, the people stood watching. The rulers even sneered at Him. They said, He saved others, let Him save Himself if He is God's Messiah, the chosen one. Right? What a statement. Right? They're saying, if you are the Messiah, the chosen one, then save yourself. Was Jesus the Messiah? Yes. Is he the chosen one? Yes. Did he have to prove it? He was proving it by not saving himself. It goes on. The challenges Jesus faced in that agonizing death when he was said, okay, if you're really who you are, then save yourself. Could he have saved himself? Yes. By not saving himself, they were going, there's proof. There's proof he's not who he says he is. It doesn't stop there. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the king of the Jews, then save yourself. Doesn't stop there. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Then save yourself. Save yourself. Right? Are there times, maybe it's because people know I work at a church, but there have been times that, if you're a Christian, how can you let whatever happen? Right? And people judge what Christians are supposed to do and what they're supposed to be like, and usually it would be like, if you are really a follower of Jesus, then how could you have let the high priest servants arrest him? How could you have done nothing? Right? Those are usually the type of questions. And Jesus gets them as he's hanging on the cross. But the criminal didn't stop there. He said, aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. This would be really cool, right? Here we are, we're getting crucified with you. Why don't you save? But that's the problem. Save yourself and us. When in that moment, Jesus was making the decision of whether he would save himself or them. Save yourself or us was the question Jesus answered. And Jesus chose to suffer all of those insults, all of those accusations, all of those lies in a way where he was asking for forgiveness for those who were accusing him. And he assumed the best in them. They don't know what they're doing. I honestly think the only way that Jesus was able to survive all of this is because he forgave them. What he was entitled to, the rights that he held, if he had held on to that burden and agony and hatred, he would have had to save himself rather than us. But as he walked down that path, the only way that he was able to do what he did was by walking the path of forgiveness and the assumption that these people didn't know what they were doing. How do you get through tough times in your life? Try following Jesus. It carries on. This is the other criminal. He says, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. And that's absolutely true. But the gospel is not about wrong and right. It is about lost and found. In fact, following Jesus is actually laying down our rights. And then I love this. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It's like Jesus said, remember you? How can I forget you? We're going together, right? I don't need to remember you. I'm not forgetting you. We're going together. Today you will be with me, which is the whole point of the gospel. The whole point of the gospel is that we walk with Jesus, that we spend eternity with Jesus. The whole point of the gospel is about relationship with Jesus of Nazareth. Remember you. I can't forget you. You know, we are often kind of classed into one of these two categories when it comes to Jesus. I think in general, you know, if people actually study Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, there have been a lot of great leaders who have quoted Jesus, been a lot of horrible leaders who have quoted Jesus as well. In general, I think most people admire Jesus. I admire Jesus for dying on the cross, for forgiving me my sins, for giving me access to eternity with him. I admire him for that. A lot of times, our Christian lives are spent in the admiration of Jesus. We admire what he's done. But following? See, it's really hard to check this box. Am I a follower of Jesus, or am I an admirer of Jesus? Because following Jesus, if you want to be my disciple, then deny yourself, take up your cross daily, follow me. Where do you fit in this? Back, Luke 23, the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. This is significant. It's symbolic. In the temple, it's in Jerusalem, there was a curtain. There were actually two. One separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place, and one was the entrance to the holy place. And it doesn't matter which one was torn, but I believe it was the inner one. And it's torn from top to bottom. Nobody could get up there to tear it. It's like 4 inches thick. The ground shook. And symbolically, God opened access to the most personal and intimate place of God known on earth. We are called into this relationship with God that is not from a distance. It's not through practice. It's not through tradition. It's not through good deeds. It's actually through intimacy with God. Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. Jesus died the way he'd lived, with his arms wide open. His message and his path was through forgiveness. He came for the forgiveness of sins. He came calling you to follow him in the pathway of forgiveness. When it comes to forgiveness, I've said this before, I see it as this. I think unforgiveness is a prison we build around ourselves. Unforgiveness is a prison we build around ourselves. It separates us from people. It separates us from relationship. When you, and we all know people, maybe this is you, it's been me. When we live in unforgiveness, it affects us emotionally and it affects us relationally. And there is a path that Jesus leads us on that avoids those issues. It's simply stop the unforgiveness and walk in forgiveness. Not because you deserved it, but because it's the best path to follow Jesus. And the best path to follow Jesus is the best life you can live. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And then we're faced with this. When all the people who had gathered to witness the sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. These were the admirers of Jesus. They had probably heard his teachings. They went to see what happened when he died. That was it. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance and watching these things. You know, there's a temptation often to walk away from Jesus if we're simply admirers. And it's easy to walk away from Jesus when we don't see Jesus doing the things that we want him to do, when we see injustice, when we suffer, when we are forced to deny ourselves. That's when admirers walk away from Jesus. They walk away from, they may not call themselves not Christian anymore, but they don't live in the freedom God calls them to live in. Are you an admirer or a follower? I'll close with this. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. This is an example for us. Because Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. Are you struggling with Christianity? Are you finding that it isn't delivering what you thought it might and should deliver? How's your forgiveness? What are you hanging on to? Have you simply signed on to a Christianity that's pray a prayer and go to church and listen to some good music, and hopefully the music is powerful enough to stick with me for the week? You know, am I getting enough buzz from a church service to support what I got to walk through in a week? Or is your Christianity a daily surrender? And when you start to struggle, do you walk away from Jesus, or do you lean into Jesus? Do you fight against your circumstances, or do you surrender to your circumstances and allow God to work through you in them? Are you an admirer or a follower? I feel like in every one of these talks I've had to say at the end, none of us are perfect. And all of us are walking through this. I think forgiveness starts with a decision, but it follows with a process. Are you willing to walk through that process to experience freedom from what isolates you emotionally and relationally? I told you I'm not a great example. I was watching something this week. Rachel Den Hollander was a victim of Larry Nassar, the USA Olympic doctor who sexually assaulted so many young girls. And I had an opportunity to watch her speak to Larry at his sentencing period, giving a victim impact statement. If you get a chance to watch that, it's absolutely heart-wrenching. And yet she reveals how she has been able to walk in freedom through forgiveness. And yet, as she speaks to Larry, one big statement that she keeps making is, what is the value of a little girl? We're in a world where people are victims, where people are hurt. There is requirements for justice. There is what happens to people who are victims of this person if you don't report them. There are a lot of aspects in this and complications and complexities. Forgiveness is not just about letting somebody go on and abuse somebody else. But forgiveness, somewhere in that process, is allowing yourself to be free through forgiveness of those who have abused you, by accepting the circumstances you find yourself in now and releasing the anger of the person toward the person that got you there, and being able to walk in freedom and peace and joy and relationship with the people around you. May you experience God in the circumstances you find yourself in. May you know what it is to be at peace, and may you know what it is to be loved by a Father, by a God, by Jesus, who, when he says to the thief on the cross, I don't need to remember you because I'm not forgetting you. How could I when you are with me? May you be that close to Jesus, and may you have a great week.